Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it had happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Millie was hunted out for the day, Mr. and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down to the cellar. Their business there was of private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. That they had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall had found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert of principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found that the bottle had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts in front of the door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch, and with a flash of inspiration he connected with the stranger's room upstairs the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight he stopped, gaping, then, the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty. And what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he had heard his wife's voice coming out from the depths of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note, by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. George, you Gart and wad a wand. You. At that he turned and hurried down to her. Janny, he said, over the rail of the cellar steps, "'Tas the truth what Humphrey says. He's not in his room. He ain't. And the front door is unbolted." At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she resolved to see that the empty room for herself, Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "If he ain't there," he said, "he's close. And what's he doin'? Thou is close then. That's a most curious business." As they came up the cellar steps, it was afterwards fancied they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed in the staircase. Hall, following the 6 steps behind, thought that he had heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet on the topmost stair, but in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow and then under her clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if the hand had clutched them to the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described with a whirling flight of the air through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Miss Hall's face. As swiftly it came the sponge when the washstand, and then at the chair, flinging at the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like a stranger's, turned itself up with four legs at Mrs. Hall, seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, but then the chair came gently firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph, and for a moment, and then abruptly, everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost immediately fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Millie, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "Test spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know test spirits. I have been read papers of 'em. Tables and chairs leaping and dancing. Take a drop more, Janny," said Hall. "Till you steady ye. Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I guessed. I might have known that with them goggling eyes and bandaged head and never going to church on a Sunday and the all bottles. More'nt it was right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture. My good furniture. I was that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit in when I was a little girl. To think it would rise up against me now. Just a drop more, Janny," said Ed Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." They sent Millie across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's complement and furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Wadgers come round? He was a knowing man, was Mr. Wadgers, and very resourceful, and he took quite a grave view of the case. Darned if that weren't witchcraft, was the view of Mr. Sandy Wadgers. If you want horseshoes for such a gentry as he came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry at all. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way Huckster's appearance came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to the joint discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for a parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk for no decisive action. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "Let's be sure we'd be acting perfectly right in busting that there door open. A door out on burst is always open to bustin', but you can't bust a door once you've busted it." Then, and suddenly, and most wonderfully, on the door on the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever in those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage, staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and then their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger, and then saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor, and suddenly, swiftly, viciously, slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "Well, if that don't look anything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. "I'd go back in and ask about it," said Wadgers to Mr. Hall. "I demand an explanation. It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch, and at last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, and said, "Shut that door after you." So that brief interview terminated. Chapter 7. Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. Him and his "Go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came an imperfect groomer of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Wadgers, went off to find Shuckleforth and Mr. Great, and took his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. How and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huxter came over. Some gay young fellows, resplendent in a black ready-made jackets and paper ties, for it was Whit Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Iping youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shouting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies wore white aprons, and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Wadger of the Purple Fawn and Mr. Jagger, the cobbler, who had also sold out old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks on royalty and signs which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee across the road. And inside, an artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry we must suppose, had fearful hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through the dark glasses upon his paper, chinked in his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of a half-dozen smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted in the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon, he suddenly opened the parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people at the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "It is your bill you're wanting, sir," she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know." "I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting remittance. I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await no remittances. You can't grumble. If you can't grumble your breakfast waits a bit. If my bill's waiting for these 5 days, can't you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Nar, nar," from the bar. "And I'd thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more at the angry driving helmet than ever, and it was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hall. I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Still, I dare say, in my pocket. You have told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you." "Well, I've found some more. Laos from the bar." "I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "And before I take any bills or get any breakfast or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how your room's was empty. I want and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the door. That's the rule of this house, and that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in. And I want to know." Suddenly, the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop!" with an extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a blank cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which he, staring at the metamorphosized face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw it, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. He then removed his spectacles, and everyone at the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh my God," said someone. Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps. For the men who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was the solid gesticulating figure up to the collar of him. Then nothingness. No visible thing at all. The people down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down and Mr. Teddy Henfrey jumping to avoid tumbling her over. Then they heard the frightful screams of Millie, who, emerging from suddenly the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith everyone down the street, the sweet stuffed seller, coconut shy proprietor, and his assistant, the swingman, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart watches, smocked elders, and aproned gypsies began running toward the inn, and miraculously short space of a time crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted, inquired and exclaimed and suggested, all in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk all at once, and the result of the babble, a small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, with an incredible evidence of verificious eyewitness. "Oh, Bogey, what's he been doing then? Ain't the girl, is he? Run at him with a knife, I believe. No, I tell you, I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean, a man without a head. Nonsense! This some conjuring trick fetched off. It's rapping. I did it. In its struggles to see and through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex nearest to the inn. He stood for a moment, heard the gal scream, and as he turned, I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife and is in hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago. Went in the door there. I tell you, I ain't got no Ed at all. You just missed it. There was a disturbance behind him. And then the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Rogers. They had come now armed with a warrant. The people shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. Head or no head, said Jaffers, I got to rest 'em, and rest 'em I will. Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door in the parlor and flung it open. Constable, he said, do your duty. Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Rogers last. They saw the dim light and the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. That's him, said Hall. What the devil's this? Came a tone of angry expulsion from above the collar figure. You're the damned rum customer, mister, said Mr. Jaffers. But head or no head, the warrant says, body the duty and duty's duty. Keep off, said the figure, starting back. Abruptly, he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped a little knife from the table to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and slapped Jaffers in the face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, and gripped him by the handless wrist and caught the invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin, and that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sensed the knife sliding along the table to Rogers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting in. The chair stood in the way and went aside in the crash as they came down together. Get the feet, said Jaffers behind his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on the instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs and disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Rogers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over on the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, so collided with Mr. Huxter's and Slider Bridge, cater opening to rescue law and of order. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles of the chiffonier and shot the web of pugnancy into the air of the room. I'll surrender, cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up panting, the strange figure headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove and now as well as left. It's no good, he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming from empty space. But Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also the produced pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. I say, said Jaffers, brought up by a short, dim realization of the incongruency of the whole business. Darn it! Can't use him as I can see. The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, as if by a miracle buttons which empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin, and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. Why, said Huxter suddenly, that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm. He extended his hand. It seemed to me something in mid-air. He drew it back and with a sharp exclamation exclamation. "I wish you could keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice, in the tone of savage expulsion. "The fact is, I'm all here, head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it. But it happens that I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin and Iping, is it?" The suit of clothes, now unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the menfolks had now entered the room. It was now closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard the likes of that? It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility, it's a burglary. And there's a house been broke into and money took. Well, and circumstances certainly point." "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, but I've got my instructions." "Well," said the stranger, I'll come, but no handcuffs." That's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs?" stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped his waistcoat, and it struggled. The shirt slipped out of it and left it limp in his empty in his hand. "Hold him," said Jaffers loudly. "Once he gets the things off—" "Hold him!" cried everyone. And there was a rush of the flattering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance, and then sent him backward into an old toothsome of the sexton. And in another moment, the garment was lifted up and became convulsed by a vacantly flapping about the arms. Even as a shirt that was being thrust over a man's head, Jaffers clutched at it, and only helped to pull it off. There was struck at the mouth of the air, and inconsistently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out!" said everybody, fencing at a random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him!" "Shut the door! Don't let him loose! I got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wagers, knowing it was as never was, as his whip sharpened by a frightful blow of the noise, reopened the door and led the rout. The others, following incontently, were jammed for a moment in the corner of the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his left ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Huckster at the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt the muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass struggling, excited men shot out into a crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with a purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered left and right, and as an extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly toward the house and the door, and went spinning down and half a dozen steps in the inn. Jaffers cried a strangled voice, holding tight, nevertheless, making play in his knee, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head in gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There was there were excited cries of, "Hold him! Invisible!" and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in a place whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, fell over, and Constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with a transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space of people stood amazed and gesticulating, and came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village, and gust scattered dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward, knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. Chapter 8. In Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief, and it relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while laying out upon the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself. And looking beheld nothing, yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear that breadth and variety distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away into the distance, going, as it seemed to him, the direction of Adarian. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquility vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could go. Boy, I wish the rest of the chapters were this quick. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to an ebon point, his short limbs actuated to this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat and a frequent substitution of twine and shoe laces for buttons. Apparent critical points of his costume marked a man of essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch on the roadside over the down towards Adarian, about a mile and a half out of Iping. His feet, save for socks of an regular open work, were bare. His big toes were broad and pricked like ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, very comfortable fit, but too thin, soled for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he had hated most. It was a pleasant day, but there was nothing better to do. He had put the four shoes in the graceful grip of the turf and looked at him, and seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots, anyhow," said the voice. "They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side regarding them distastefully, "and which the ugliest pair of the whole blessed universe. I'm damned if I know." Said the voice. "I've worn worse. In fact, I've worn none, but none of most audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been cadging boots, in particular for days, because I was sick of them. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on a tramp sees a thundering lot of his boots, and if you'll believe me, I've raised nothing in the whole blessed country. They try as I would, but them, look at 'em! and a good country for boots. In a general way, that's just my promiscuous luck. I've got my boots in this country for 10 years or more, and they treat you like this. It's a beast of a country, said the voice, and pigs for people. Ain't it? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel. Lord, but look at them boots. It beats it. Look. He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots for his interlocutor with a view of comparisons. And lo, there were the boots of his interlocutor should have been were neither legs nor boots. He was irradiated by the dawn of great amazement. Where are you? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel over his shoulder and coming on all fours. He saw a stretch of empty downs and the wind swaying in a remote green pointed furze bushes. Am I drunk? Said Mr. Marvel. Have I had visions? Was I talking to myself? What the? Don't be ashamed, said a voice. None of your ventriloquizing me, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. Warrior! Alarmed, indeed. Don't be alarmed, repeated a voice. You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool, said Mr. Thomas Marvel. Where are you? Let me get my mark on you. Are you buried? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel after an interval. There was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed, his jacket nearly thrown off. Peewit, said a peewit, very remote. Peewit indeed, said Mr. Thomas Marvel. This ain't no time for foolery. The down was a desolate east and west, north and south. The road with its shallow ditches, white bordering stakes, ran smooth and empty north and south. The save for the peewit, blue sky and empty too. So help me, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, shuffling his coat and shoulders again. It's the drink. I might have known. It's not the drink, said the voice. Keep your nerves steady. Ow! Said Mr. Thomas Marvel, and his face grew white amidst the patches. It's the drink, his lips repeated noiselessly. He remained staring about them, rotating slowly backwards. I could have swore I'd heard a voice, he whispered. Of course you did. It's there again, said Mr. Marvel, closing his eyes and clasping his hand on his brow with a tragic gesture. There. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently. Left more dozed than ever. Don't be a fool, said the voice. I'm off my blooming chump, said Mr. Marvel. It's no good. It's fretting about them blasted boots. I'm off my blessed blooming chump, or it's spirits. Neither one thing or the other, said the voice. Listen, chump, said Mr. Marvel. 1 minute, said the voice, penetratingly tremulous with self-control. Well, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest by one finger. You think I'm just imagination? Just imagination? What else can you be? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rubbing his back on his neck. Very well, said the voice in a tone of relief. Then I'm going to throw flints at you until you think differently. But where are you yet? The voice made no answer. Whiz came a flint, apparently about out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair of breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace and complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Whiz it came. It ricocheted from the bared hoe to the ditch. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped at a foot and howled aloud. Then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and then held over the heels in the sitting position. Now, said the voice, as the third stone curved upward and hung up in the air above the tramp. Am I imagination? Mr. Marvel, by the way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment. If you struggle any more, said the voice, I'll throw flint at your head. It's fair A fair ado, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded hand and fixing his eye on the third missile. I don't understand it. Stones flinging themselves, stones talking. You put yourself down, rot away, I'm done. The third flint fell. It's very simple, said the voice. I'm an invisible man. Tell us something I don't know, said Mr. Marvel, grasping with pain. Where you've hid, how you do it. I don't know. I'm beat. That's all, said the voice. I'm invisible. That's what I want you to understand. Anyone could see that. There is no need for you to be so confounded impatient, mister. Now then, give us a notion. How are you hid? I am invisible. That's the great point. And what I want you to understand is this. But whereabouts? Interrupted Mr. Marvel. Here! 6 yards in front of you! Oh, come, I ain't blind. You'll be telling me the next. You're just a thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps. Yes, I am thin air. You're looking through me. What? Ain't there any stuff to you? What X? What is it? Jabber? Is it that? I am just a human being. Solid, needing food and drink, needing covering too, but I'm invisible. You see? Invisible. Simple idea. Invisible. What? Real like? Yes, real. Let's have a hand to you, said Marvel. If you are real, you won't be so darn out of the way like then. Lord, he said, how you made me jump grippingly like that. He felt the hand that closed around his wrist and the disengaged fingers. The fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored the bearded face. Mr. Marvel's face was astonishment. I'm dashed, he said. If this don't beat cockfighting, most remarkable. And there I can see a rabbit clean through you, 1/2 mile away. Not a bit of you is visible, except he scrutinized apparently an empty space keenly. You haven't been eating bread and cheese, he asked, holding the invisible arm. You're quite right, and that's not quite assimilated into the system. Ah, said Mr. Marvel, sort of ghostly stuff. Yes, of course, all of this isn't so half wonderful as you think. It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants, said Mr. Thomas Marvel. How manage it? How is it done? It's too long a story, and besides, I tell you, the whole business fairly beats me, said Mr. Marvel. What I want to say at present is this. I need your help. I've come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering, mad with rage, naked, impotent, and I could have murdered, and I saw you. Lord, said Mr. Marvel. I came up behind you, hesitated, went on. Mr. Marvel's expression was equivalent, then stopped. Here, I said, I isn't outcast like like myself. This is the man for me. So I turned back and came to you. You, and Lord, said Mr. Marvel, but I'm all in a tizzy. May I ask, how is it? And what you may be requiring in the way of help? Invisible. I want you to help me get clothes and shelter, and then with other things. I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you must. Look here, said Mr. Marvel. I'm too flabbergasted. Don't knock me about anymore and leave me go. I must get a steady bit. You've pretty near broken my toe. It's all so unreasonable. Empty downs, empty sky, nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature. And then comes a voice of heaven and stones and a fist. "Lord, pull yourself together," said the voice, for you have done the job I have chosen for you." Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. "I have chosen you," said the voice. "You are the only man, some of these fools down here, who knows there are such things as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power." He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently. "But if you betray me," he said, "and if you fail to do as I direct you," he paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch. "I don't want to betray you," said Mr. Marvel, edging away from the direction of his fingers. "Don't you go thinking of that. Whatever you do, all I want you to do is help you. Just tell me what I got to do. Lord, whatever have you done? What that I'm most willing to do." Chapter 10. Mr. Marvel's Visit to Iping. After the first gusty panic had spent itself, Iping became argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head, rather nervous skepticism, not at all assured of its back, but skepticism nevertheless. It was so much easier not to believe an invisible man, and those who had actually seen him dissolve into air, or felt strength of his arm, could be counted on the fingers of two hands, and that these witness Mr. Rogers was presently missing, having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house, and Jaffers was lying stunned in the parlor of the Coach and Horses. Great and strange ideas transcending the experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Iping was gay with bunting, and everybody was a gala dress. Whit Monday had been looked forward to for over a month more. By the afternoon, even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had quite gone away. With the skeptics he was already jest, but people, skeptics and believers alike, were remarkably sociable all that day. Haysman Meadow was gay with a tent in which was Mrs. Bunting and other ladies preparing tea, while without the Sunday school children ran races and played games under the noisy guidance of the curate and Mrs. Cuss and Sackbut. No doubt there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people for most part had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they had experienced. On the village green, an inclined strong rope, down which, clinging while to a pulley swung handle, to one could be hurled violently against the sack which to the other end, came for a considerable favor among the adolescents, and also did the swings of the coconut shies. There was also a promending and steam organ attached to the small roundabout, filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil and equally pungent music. Members of the club who had attended the church all morning were splendid in patches of pink and green, and some of the gayer-minded had also adorned their bowler hats and brilliant colored flavors of ribbon. Old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday-making were severe, was visible through jasmine as about his window or through the door, whichever way you may choose to look, poised delicately on the plank supported on two chairs, and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock, the stranger entered a village from the direction of the downs. He was short, stout person, an extraordinary shabby and top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed. His mottled face was apprehensive, and as he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity, he turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the Coach and Horses. Among the others, old Fletcher remembers seeing him indeed, and the old gentleman was so struck by a peculiar agitation that he had indifferently allowed the quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. The stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the coconut, shy appeared to be talking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped at the foot of the coach and horses steps, and according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to undergo a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally, he marched up the steps, and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room and the bar appraising the man of his error. "That room's private," said Hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes he appeared, wiping his lips and the back of his hand in an air of quiet satisfaction that somehow impressed Mr. Huckster as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk into the oddly fruitive manner gates of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leant against one of the gate posts, produced in the short clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His fingers trembled while doing so. He lit clumsily, and folding his arms, began to smoke a languid attitude, an attitude which occasional glances up the yard altogether belied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of a man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observations. Presently, the stranger stood abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket. Then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith, Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of petty larcency, leapt around his counter and ran out the road and intercepted the thief. As he did so, Mr. Marvel reappeared, his hat askew and a big bundle in a blue tablecloth in one hand, 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards, with a vicar's braces in the other. Directly he saw Miss Huckster, he gave a sort of gasp. And turning sharply to the left, began to run. "Stop, thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid but brief, but he saw the man just before him and spurting briskly for the church and the hill road. He saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or so turned towards him. He bawled, stopped again. He had hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion. There was no longer running, but flying at an inconceivable rapidity through the air. Although the ground suddenly close to his face, the world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings had interested him no more.